Hello, Star Citizen Universe. My name is Atlas. I am joined by my colleague here, Ben Richards, and we're both from Nakama Ventures organization. We're here to bring you a podcast to talk about the things that have happened over the last week or two. Specifically, in this podcast, CitizenCon. You know, all the things that happened there. Some of the updates that we heard from the FPS team regarding the FPS module and all the things that are happening with that. And also with the upcoming PAX Australia. So let's start off with the CitizenCon updates, all the cool things that happened there, the things that interest us, and I'll hand it off to Ben Richards.
Okay, so the two biggest things that I think stood out to me from CitizenCon was the Cutlass commercial and the Persistent Universe demo. So let's start off with the Cutlass commercial. I felt like it did a really good job of showcasing what I believe to be the biggest selling point, at least on the stats page for the Cutlass, which is its maneuverability. What do you think, Alice?
I agree. Obviously they were trying to orchestrate the commercial to show that it's almost dancing in space, right? Like it had the music going on for
the tango.
Exactly, yeah, and it shows the thing, like dodging missiles essentially, which is, while awesome, I think is kind of a caricature of that. But I also kind of like that. I like that they kind of added some comedy and spice to the commercials, because lately it's been like, watching Ford F-150 commercials, things of that nature. It's kind of nice to take a step back and enjoy the comedy of the ship at a point.
Right, and a while back I saw someone complaining that they felt like the commercials were getting a little too serious, a little too bland, and one of my favorite commercials that they've done is actually one of the really early ones, the Aurora commercial, which is very upbeat, very fun, and I feel like the M50 commercial and the most recent Cutlass commercial have done a very good job of kind of bringing that fun back to their in-universe commercials.
Oh yeah, and actually I was really surprised. I've always liked the way the Cutlass looked, but it wasn't really a ship that interested me personally in buying. But after seeing the commercial, I was kind of like, man, it would be kind of fun to have one of those.
Yeah, it's always been kind of one of those ships for me too. I always really appreciated the aesthetics. I never really felt like it would 100% fit in with exactly what I wanted to do, or at least not as I'm not one of those guys that can afford to buy all the ships that have come out, so I have to be very choosy, and it just wasn't one of those ships I felt like would absolutely fit with what I was planning on doing, and so it was never really one I planned on buying. After that trailer dropped, I looked at the ship stats page for it just out of curiosity, and it's the maneuvering thruster arrangement's very interesting. It actually has 12 maneuvering thrusters, 8 of which are size 1, they're TR1s, but that's not a lot considering how much it weighs, 36,000 kilograms. But the other 4 maneuvering thrusters are size 3, so it's got some monster maneuvering thrusters.
TR3s rather.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's got 2 of those, I believe, are underneath the main engines in the rear, and then the other 2 TR3s are mounted on the sides of the craft. So.
Yeah, and I think in terms of, like you were saying earlier, it really sells that point. You know what I mean? But even beyond that, we were talking about trying to fit it into what we want to do in Star Citizen. What did you think about the variants that had released?
I thought the variants were really interesting, especially the search and rescue ship, the Cutlass Red, which is basically a flying ambulance. I think that adds a lot to what people are going to be able to do in Star Citizen. The blue is also very interesting. We kind of already had a bounty hunting ship with the Avenger, which had those lockdown pods in the cargo bay that had been shown off quite some time ago. But the new Cutlass Blue actually has full holding cells. I believe it has 6 in the cargo hold. And if you buy the package with it, I believe it comes with a stun baton and some kind of restraint, correct?
Right, yeah.
So that... Oh, no.
Blah, 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 blah. Okay, what I was going to say actually is the kind of nice thing is that you could, if you are a bounty hunter, if that's going to be what you want to do in the universe, the blue Cutlass basically lets you extend the amount of time you're operating as a bounty hunter. Once you're in an Avenger, if you go out and you capture somebody, you're done. You've already hit your max your max capacity at 1, right? Like I think that was.
I'm not sure how many they decided that could hold, because it was kind of shown off a really long time ago, but I haven't seen anything about it since then.
Yeah.
But I will say there's definitely a lot more space, like, and they don't have to be unconscious. So
right, and the Cutlass, it's expected to have multi-crew members. You're pretty much asking with the Cutlass Blue to have a bunch of small organizations develop their own buddy cop sitcoms in these ships, essentially. Right. Because that's what it is. You go out and either you're a bounty hunter or the police and militia. If that's what you're going to be doing, then it's like a great ship for that.
It'll also be interesting to see how pirate and bandit factions use this ship as a Trojan horse, almost, so to speak, because it's it's essentially the Crown Victorian of the Star Citizen universe that we've seen so far. It's blue. It's got like the lights and everything like that.
Right.
It's the bounty hunter and police ship. So be interesting to see how their tactics evolve out of that.
Yes. And not to leave it out, we have the black, which is just the basic model.
Right. I don't believe anything major changed out of the black. I believe the red and the blue are both hull specific variants on the black. And the blue is able to carry a larger power plant than the other two.
Yeah, so it's just, full disclosure. There are price differences, obviously, because the blue does have things that the red and black cannot have. Now, if you want to talk about it now, why don't we go over how the red search and rescue is expected to work, in terms of being able to heal people and, how it's going to store the bodies, etc.
Right. My understanding on how they're going to have it work is there are 2 beds that are essentially auto dock platforms. So I imagine you'd, get somebody who's injured, maybe been stabilized already with an IFAC, like an individual first aid kit or something like that, or maybe not even stabilized yet. You get them on board the Cutlass, you get them on this bed thing, and the robotic arms and sensors and whatever start to work on him, which should at least do the job. If it's a lower grade wound, I imagine that might just be able to fix you up good as new. If you have a more serious injury, you might use that to stabilize the person long enough to get them to a hospital ship, which we're going to talk about later, or say a planet-based hospital.
Okay. Now, I think that for those beds, you're going to need an operator for them?
That did seem to be the case. From what I could tell, there was one additional crew member listed for the Cutlass Red than the other 2, which makes sense. I mean, in addition to operating the equipment, you might also need to, go physically get them and bring them back to the ship. And if, you're busy with it, having a pilot and a Rio and the turret operator, although I need to check. I don't know if the Cutlass Red has a turret, but I do know it did have 4 crew listed as opposed to just the 3 that are usually recommended.
Right.
It does not actually have a turret. Okay.
Interesting.
So yeah, you have 2 additional people in the back in addition to the pilot to help kind of facilitate getting people back to the ship and working on them with the auto docks.
Yeah, so actually, thinking, theory crafting here, without that turret, the odds are you're not going to want to take one of those ships into combat then.
No. I mean, it has some mild defensive armament, but that mild defensive armament is like one class 2 weapon system, which isn't listed, at least not on the stats page, which is always subject to change.
Right.
And then it has those sucker punch distortion cannons with the little EMP cannons that disrupt ship systems. So right. I think your best bet in a Cutlass is a Cutlass Red at the very least is going to be to kind of avoid conflict as much as possible.
With it, without a escort of some sort.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so having talked about all that, I have to say I really was interested. I heavily contemplated getting the blue, but I just couldn't bring myself to do that because of the possibility of a deep space fighter, which we'll talk about later.
Right. I mean, the Cutlass Blue is really interesting. I really thought about it, but bounty hunting is not going to be my primary goal in the persistent universe, probably. And that is what this ship is heavily spec'd for. And then in addition to that, there's just some other ships that I'm a little bit more interested in, and so that kept me from picking up the blue. If you're interested in the blue at this point and you kind of missed this whole
The limited
event,
sale, yeah.
right, unfortunately the blue is limited. So it will probably be back at some point, but it is currently unavailable.
All right, so Cutlass commercial aside, CitizenCon had a lot of other cool stuff, particularly the Persistent Universe demo.
Yeah, I was actually very surprised by this. I saw some people kind of predicting that this might be the case in the Twitch chat at the event because, Chris Roberts had announced early on that there was going to be a surprise at the end, but I did not expect them to have a working Persistent Universe demo at CitizenCon. It was particularly interesting to see not only the planet side module, but also that they had the multi-crew ships working, because I know they did something at Gamescom, but I know at least part of that was scripted, right? Yeah. So I know one problem they had initially was getting physics to work properly, because they needed like a separate physics engine. I believe this was discussed in one of the Around the Verses a while back, where they were trying to get the basically separate physics from inside the spaceship versus outside. And it looks like they got that hurdle out of the way, which means we're probably getting a lot closer to actually having multi-crew ships being a thing we're going to get to experience in Arena Commander. I know they were projecting sometime next year for that, right? Atlas?
Yeah, because I believe they're trying to hammer out all the single crew ship first. Because there's still a lot of single pilot ships that have to get hammered out into the hangar. And I think they're trying to get that all done in Arena Commander before they move on to multi-crew.
They probably also want to make the move over to 64-bit before they do that, so they can have the larger maps.
Yes, yeah. And not only that, but we haven't even hammered out FPS yet, which I think is also coming with multi-crew.
Yeah, that would make sense.
So, yeah, I'm pretty sure multi-crew is still a few steps away at least. But you're right. At the very least, they have the mechanics of multi-crew pretty much down, it looks like.
So do you want to talk about the planet side module that we saw?
Yeah. So the planet side had a lot of interesting things. The whole demo began actually with the constellation in flight on the way down to planet side. It was really interesting to see a really smooth transition between space to atmospheric flight in the constellation. As I remember reading, they had that whole sequence scripted because it was an autopilot. And I know they have talked about having manual landings in certain instances, and I'm kind of bummed we won't have manual landing for these situations, but it makes a lot of sense considering if you watch the video, there's a lot of heavy traffic. There's a lot of buildings that you could run into. The incidence of crashing is really high, so automatic landing does make a lot of sense in this instance.
Yeah, I mean, even if you look at today, we're already having companies like Google developing, self-driving cars and things like that. So I think it is fairly believable that you would have, under such heavy traffic conditions like we saw in Stanton, you would have a requirement for auto landing, so you wouldn't have to worry about people crashing into each other on approach and things like that, just for safety reasons.
Yeah. You see an amazing approach from the Constellation to the landing pad. You see the Constellation drop its cargo, and a couple people, walk over to inspect the cargo. And then the player walks into what almost looks like a customs office.
Right. And one of the things that stood out to me the most about this was I rewatched this before we did this podcast, and I watched the version they posted after CitizenCon, which was a separate playthrough because they wanted to clean up some streaming issues they had at the event. And the player stopped in front of a sign, which was basically telling you that, if you wanted to carry a weapon, it had to be like a certain kind of weapon, and you had to have a certain amount of clearance. It was kind of hard to read because it was a little fuzzy. And when the player steps into the room where he's scanned by the customs official, you can see that the scanner has registered that he's carrying a handgun, and it then does a search on his identity, and it discovers that he has level 3 advocacy clearance. And I'm really curious to see what that is, whether or not the player is a member of the advocacy, which I believe is the UEE's law enforcement arm, or if it's some kind of permit you get, or some kind of like reputation level you have with the advocacy that lets you carry on certain worlds.
Yeah, and definitely whether or not that level is going to change depending on how close to the core systems you are, or if it's something that you literally buy as long as you're not a criminal.
Right. I think Stanton, that whole ArcCorp environment that they showed off, it definitely looked like it was a very civilized area. Maybe not quite to the level of like Earth or Terra, but the UEE definitely had a strong presence there. I'm really curious to see how that is going to affect more border worlds where the UEE's influence is not quite as strong and it's a more lawless region.
Yes, yeah, and that actually does connect with some of the things they're talking about in the FPS module that we can get to later. But was there anything else you wanted to talk about, like the shops or anything else that you saw while you were in the planet side that you wanted to discuss, or are we going to end it there?
I mean, it's unfortunate that we couldn't see more of the shops because they didn't quite have them finished yet. But I did really like the depot they went into. I felt like it had a lot of atmosphere, and I feel like players are going to be spending a lot of time because they have said previously that they're going to have a simulated economy, so everywhere is not going to have every item you need. So I feel like players are going to spend a lot of time hitting different shops in different places, trying to track down that one rare weapon they've been looking for, that one rare shield generator they've been looking for. So Dumper's Depot kind of looked like almost like a scrapyard kind of shop.
Especially with the Hornet in the back that looks like it's being repurposed.
Right, so I feel like players are going to spend a lot of time hitting little shops like this on different planets trying to find that one part they're looking for. So it'll be really interesting to see how that develops in the universe.
Yeah. And that was pretty much the end of the Persistent Universe demo at that point. CitizenCon actually had a lot of stuff that specifically mentioned how much they appreciated subscribers, backers, and that actually took up quite a bit of CitizenCon, which, I don't know about you, but made me feel not only appreciated, but that we had a part in its development.
Yeah, and I'm also really glad to see. I mean, they seemed very, very upbeat, very, just genuinely thankful about it. And I'm glad because a lot of people do raise valid complaints on the on the forums for various topics and stuff, but certain things on the forums have a tendency to get very toxic, and I'm glad to see that's not taking too much of a toll on the morale at Cloud Imperium.
Yeah, definitely. So I was the whole experience of CitizenCon was really cool for me. There was a lot of talk, especially at the beginning, about there isn't a game, you know what I mean? There isn't any product. Everything is vaporware, so on and so forth. And every month there's an improvement. Every time they add something, it just feels, makes me feel that much more glad that I donated money like I did, or put money in like I did.
Right, and I think after they got past Arena Commander initially, that was like a really big hurdle for them to get past. And after that, it seems like their development is exponentially getting faster. Like every time they get some new improvement, it helps them get the next thing done even quicker. Like they seem to be developing ships and just everything way faster than they were a year ago.
Yes. Yeah. And that's, they actually talk about, part of that in the ship pipeline, which I think we'll also get to a little bit later. But moving on, in this past week, we actually had a cool little session with Redacted, who is taking care of the FPS module, and essentially they were fielding questions on the the forums and also on the Reddit for Star Citizen. They discussed a lot of mechanics that were either planned or already implemented inside the module, and we wanted to just touch on the basics of that, just in case people didn't want to go through the 16 pages of forums or God knows how long that Reddit post was. So just to touch on a few of the things, we're going to discuss the inspiration, some of the design principles of the game. Included inside of that is going to be the fact that they're really trying to keep a high level of fidelity for the gameplay in terms of realism, camera management, things like that. We're going to discuss items and weapons and customization. We're going to briefly talk about combat and a few other things included in that, like movement and how radar and all that stuff's going to work. In terms of inspiration, they actually discussed specific games that they were drawing inspiration from. Specifically, they were talking about Counter-Strike, which kind of caught me by surprise, considering the company it's keeping, which is Rainbow Six, Arma, and Delta Force.
Actually, it's funny you mentioned that, because I was just looking over the doc as you were talking, and I was thinking the exact same thing. Like, Counter-Strike seems like a really strange pick. But then I started thinking about it. While Counter-Strike is, very much like a Twitch shooter, it does incorporate certain tactical aspects, like, using flashbangs and things like that. And so I can actually kind of see why they might consider that a source of inspiration when you compare it against all the other ones that they presented.
Yeah, and I can understand that. If you were to dissect the parts, it was definitely one of the first games I could think of where they included smoke bombs to kind of cloud your approach and flashbangs to disorient an enemy. And it was also one of the first games I can think of where they had voice chat so you could actually coordinate.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think of that.
So there was a lot of things that it definitely frontiered. But it seems, when you take the game as a whole, I guess, it seems a little different from games like Rainbow Six, Arma, Delta Force, which are more simulator than game after a certain point.
Right. I'm actually really excited because as of right now, I love Rainbow Six. I have not played Delta Force, but Arma is actually probably one of the games I spend the most amount of time in. And so the fact that they're going with a realistic approach and that Arma is one of their main inspirations actually is really encouraging to me.
Yeah, and that's one of the things too, is that Arma is really a game where it's only as fun as you make it.
Right.
If you want to, go and play online, you can have as much fun as you want, depending on how you approach the game.
I only have one concern based on the inspirations they've chosen, and that is when you go for high realism in a shooter, it can have a tendency to make things a little bit more clunky, and it also has a tendency to make things more challenging. It has which I guess goes without saying, but it has a steeper learning curve if you're someone who's new to that kind of game.
Absolutely. And that is also something that I'm not only worried about, but also the development team seems to be worried about.
Right.
They have mentioned that it will definitely have a steeper learning curve, for the FPS module, but also that they're hoping they're making it a little bit more streamlined to pick up, just that much harder to master. That being said, it will be a difficult game to learn, especially when you consider that you're going to have to deal with other players that are going to be pirates trying to board your ship. So in regards to that, for training and things, that is what the FPS module is expected to be. A lot like Arena Commander, it's going to be a place where you can learn the skills, at least to basically defend yourself or, compete in combat without embarrassing yourself, without having to pay the cost that you would normally pay in a persistent universe.
Right, and that's one thing I really think is awesome about the fact that Star Citizen's community is so large at this point. There's so many backers. There's so many people who are really excited about this whole project, and there's we have so many people playing Arena Commander right now who are getting used to playing dogfighting and stuff like that, and with the FPS module, they're going to get used to doing that. So and then finally, we're going to have Squadron 42 for that last little bit. So by the time we all get into the persistent universe, everyone should at least have a very basic understanding of the various aspects of the game.
Right, yeah. So at the very least, no one should be coming to it cold. Especially because, if I recall, Squadron 42 is supposed to be the thing that grants you citizenship.
Yeah, I'd heard that early on. I'm really curious to see how how important they make citizenship, because I know that there's also going to be the option of not, going through Squadron 42 and going into the persistent universe, but there might be some penalties associated with that. So we'll have to see. But
how that's managed.
Right.
Yeah.
But going back to the point of how many people are invested in this game already, assuming I'm reading this right, on the front page of Robert Space Industries, there are 634,000 Star Citizens, which I think is just accounts.
Right.
And then there's the UEE fleet, which is 487,581 people who I believe have backed the game, which I think that's incredible.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. And you'll find that there's hardly, I think, a more dedicated or energetic group of supporters than Star Citizens.
Right, which is actually, honestly, one of the reasons why, at least me personally, I felt compelled to make this podcast, because I've never done a podcast before or anything like this, but I'm really, really excited about this game, and I know there's a lot of other people who are really, really excited about this game as well. So I felt like this would be a really good way to, share information and just get my opinions out on certain topics related to it.
Yep. So aside from, the high level of, just mentioning what the FPS module is there for, what the inspiration is for the game, the development team also wanted to make sure we knew that they are trying to address, cheating in the game, specifically aimbots. Because when you think about the game, it's supposed to be a approach from a tactical perspective. No one's supposed to be running out there with an M60 laying waste to everything in his wake. You're supposed to approach it from a very careful, a very measured approach. And one of the things that people are worried about is aimbots. They mentioned specifically that their lead programmer thinks he may have found a very unique way of approaching the problem. And I'm hoping that in the end, it's a good fix.
Yeah, I mean, that's almost a requirement these days for any shooter. I mean, especially in a world like Star Citizen where, death is going to carry... Well, it's not a substantial penalty, but you really don't want to die in the world of Star Citizen.
Yeah, at the very least, the character that you have will pay severe punishment or severe penalties.
Right.
Artificial limbs, permanent scars, things of that nature.
I wouldn't say like the penalty for death is as steep as some cases in, like, say, DayZ, for example, but it's still pretty steep. And I feel like if there is a prevalent cheating problem with things like aimbots and Star Citizen, it could really ruin the experience for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, that's going to be more related to the FPS module. But at the same time, all of it is supposed to be incorporated into a single game so that everyone can enjoy different aspects of different gameplay.
Right.
So it would feel like a less inclusive experience at that point if people couldn't enjoy FPS module. So moving on from there was a lot of discussion about the basic tenets of combat, specifically movement and cover, and a lot of things are going to be related to the animation of the character. Things like reloading, taking cover, healing yourself. If you don't actually finish the animation for any of those things, like taking the magazine out of a gun and putting a new one back in for reloading, then you won't accomplish the task. Which I think is amazing. It's again going to that extra step of fidelity that most games aren't willing to approach.
Yeah, I think that is really interesting. They talked a little bit about how they're going to handle like inventory management and stuff like that, right? They said they took inspiration from Stalker and Crysis, I believe.
Yes, Crysis 3. So at least from the inventory perspective of Crysis 1 and 2, I can tell you what it's like, but I've personally never played Crysis 3.
Right, and I played Stalker, and I really liked that game, but it's been so long, I can't really remember clearly how they handled their inventory system. But you played Crysis 1 and 2, correct?
Yeah.
How is the inventory system in that, at the very least?
The inventory system, that's actually really streamlined. Essentially, I guess you could almost look at it from the holotable perspective, where you would have, either in the holotable you can bring out your ship and then all the individual parts pop out and then you can click and change them. That's pretty much how the weapon works in Crysis, is you'd have your weapon and then you could hover over an individual part which would pop out and show all the list of available replacement parts that would go in there. It was really streamlined, it was simple to understand. You didn't have to go ruffling through different backpacks or bags or anything to find the right part. It was all very easily managed.
So hopefully Star Citizen's FPS module will be a little bit more streamlined than the inventory system in, say, Arma, for example.
Yes, exactly. Um, so from the inventory system, I believe, going along with that, looking at items and things like that, I know that they are supposed to have at least some kind of personal shield generator, which they haven't described as if it's like a wearable thing or a deployable item. We're expected to get some power armor, and then they mentioned a lot of the different types of weapons they're going to be using. What energy-based, ballistic, things of that nature. So I'm expecting a pretty vast array of weaponry, armor items that we can use in the FPS module.
Yeah, the level of ambition just in general with Star Citizen never ceases to surprise me.
Definitely. And going along with that is, it's one thing to simulate being injured, but it's another thing entirely to not only simulate the injury, but also having an effect on other parts of gameplay, like aiming a gun. There was discussion of artificial limbs having an effect on aim, whether or not you have a broken bone, broken legs, whether or not the limb is completely crippled and needs to be replaced with an artificial limb. I mean, the lengths they're taking the FPS module to, I think it actually, considering all the level of fidelity going into space combat, I didn't expect them to put as much emphasis into FPS as being put there.
Right, I didn't expect that either. And it'll be interesting to see how the effort they put into the FPS module is going to translate over to other aspects of gameplay. Like, we were talking earlier about, the Cutlass Red variant and how they're handling damage states on people. Will be really interesting to see how that affects, search and rescue gameplay, the different medical facilities we're going to see in universe, stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely. And, going back to... if you remember, a long time ago in Star Citizen, there was a lot of disagreements about whether or not there should be third person, I finger quote, but third person views in ships. Whether or not that would be a fair or unfair advantage to certain people versus just keeping them locked to the cockpit. In the first person shooter module, they are locking you to first person camera. And not only first person camera, but the camera is actually positioned where the eyes would be of the player that you're in control of.
Right, I think that's really interesting. In Arma, I've played on servers that locked you to the first-person perspective, and it's definitely a different experience. Cover is a lot more important. The way you approach things like corners and stuff is a lot more important, because you can't just third-person peek around and make sure it's safe. You're going to have to expose yourself if you want to check that out. The only problem I have with it is, if you have too much head bob, and, that can be kind of, unnerving, and also sometimes your vision is a little narrower than you feel like it should be. But it seems like the FPS team is taking those things into account when they're designing the FPS module.
Right. And going along with that, is camera management can be kind of disorienting if you're moving a lot. I'm curious to see if that's going to have an effect in 0G, because they mentioned that 0G environments are going to be a completely a whole different experience compared to just playing with normal gravity.
Yeah, that I'm particularly interested in. There may be a game, like this out there, but I've never played it or heard of it. I played a lot of games like Arma and stuff, but I've never played a game in 0G that's as realistic as Arma or Rainbow Six or something like that. So I think that's going to be really interesting. Yeah,
definitely. And there was mention about mag boots, how the effect of gameplay on that. They were mentioning specifically propulsion in 0G. Some players who have suits will obviously have thrust backpacks to maneuver themselves around. And for those who don't, there's going to be a basic push-pull system through a ship or EVA if there's an item nearby. But they did want to stress that it is possible to over-accelerate, hit an object, and die. So you have to be very careful about the way you manage your movement in 0G. Is there anything you wanted to talk about in 0G in particular?
Not really off the top of my head. Though I do think that is really interesting that you have to be very careful about how you manage your inertia in 0G, because it can get you into a lot of trouble if you're not careful, especially if you don't have some kind of other propulsion system to slow you down or accelerate you in a certain direction.
Right. I think the only thing we really have left to talk about, we were discussing earlier about how artificial limbs would have an effect on, the way you aim. One other thing they were very adamant to point out is that recoil. In some games like Counter-Strike or Battlefield, there'll basically just be an area, and anywhere within that area is where a bullet can hit. Specifically in the FPS module in Star Citizen, wherever the gun's pointing is where you're going to hit. It's physics-based, which I think is amazing.
Yeah, I definitely prefer a system like that over just like a random hit area where, the bullet may hit somewhere in this area. So, yeah, I think that's going to be a lot better.
Kind of drawing down now, the last thing to talk about, melee combat. They will include a system of brawling. They will have, some level of stealth kills using either knives or some other melee weapon. Maybe no weapon at all. I'm not sure about that. But they definitely will have the ability to stealthily move around, the ability to kill people silently using some form of melee combat or attack, and there will be their own system of melee combat. That actually takes it a little bit further than I was expecting for melee, because this is so far into the future. I mean, who brings a gun to a knife fight? Or other way around. I meant that.
A smart person.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that is the correct answer. A smart person.
That does bring up something I did want to talk about, actually. I just remembered. The stealth mechanic, you're not going to really have a radar per se, but you are going to have something that detects movement and sound as kind of like a way of say, tracking without being able to see people.
Right, which is kind of nice. I think it'll actually force players to communicate more in game.
Right.
And that seems to be something that they're trying to go for.
Which I definitely support. I mean, especially in a game like this, the players are going to make the experience, I think.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So that pretty much covers the highlights of what was discussed in the FPS, ask and answer question or forums. So moving on from there, I believe next we have the Wave 4 ships.
Right. So far we've had 2 of the Wave 4 ships selected by voting, and then every milestone we hit, the top performing one in the poll will be chosen, and then Chris Roberts will give an explanation as to what that ship's going to be. So first up, we have the MISC Endeavor class research platform. I'm actually really excited to see what they do with this. I probably won't pick one up, at least not until far into the persistent universe, because based on how their pricing structure has been so far, I anticipate this to be very expensive. But given how modular it is, I think it's an incredibly interesting ship.
Yeah, it definitely provides new forms of gameplay that wasn't previously available. Obviously, we have the search and rescue ship and healing, so the hospital part of it might be par for the course thus far. It's the research side of it that might be a very new way of playing the game.
Right. So my understanding of how the ship is going to work is it's very modular. So yeah, you can set it up to be a hospital, but you could also set it up to be essentially a flying laboratory. You can set it up with a ton of sensors, extra shields if you want to, say, study solar activity or look for new jump points to chart, things like that. If you're going to set it up as a hospital, on the other hand, you can actually set it up so it can carry a Cutlass Red as like an ambulance to go out and retrieve people and bring them back. And you can have a higher level of medical care available to you than you would, say, in a Cutlass Red. It also appears that it's the primary medical ship of the UEE. It is a Hope class medical transport.
Yeah, and those are the legal uses of the ship.
Right. If you are, no, please.
I was gonna say, if you're more inclined to the free market side of uses of the ship, you will be able to actually use it to create drugs, essentially.
Right. So you can use it for narcotic production. So it'd be really interesting to see how they do that. Like, if you're just gonna have like a drop down list. Like today, I feel like manufacturing, cocaine. Today, yeah. I feel like manufacturing methamphetamines. I don't know exactly how they're going to do that, but that should be interesting.
Yeah, and whether or not you'll be able to create new drugs, or if it's just going to be a production site for some preset list of narcotics that are available in the system.
It'll also be interesting to see how the more criminally minded organizations handle this and how like gameplay is handled with them. Like if these are going to be manufacturing sites for narcotics, like a primary source of income possibly for some of these orgs, they're going to be very valuable and they're going to need to be defended constantly.
Just theory crafting here, but as it stands today, hospitals rather in the United States are required to report when they're treating someone with gunshots, knife wounds, things like that. It might be possible that this carries over to the UEE, in which case you could have a black market hospital operating.
Right, and I actually do believe that I've seen that mentioned somewhere. Maybe not in the literature for it exactly, but like possibly theory, crafting on the forums as well. I would not be surprised if a black market hospital is also a thing. And also, who knows, maybe, certain, artificial limbs and stuff like that are restricted by the UEE. I mean, if you've played, say, Deus Ex Human Revolution, like maybe they'll have like weird knife, limbs or something like that aren't,
right.
Legally available that you could have attached to you. So who knows?
Yeah, it's a lot of possibility there for something that really hadn't existed in universe before. So finishing up with the Endeavor, which I think is a very unique, interesting addition to the universe, let's go on to the Anvil Crucible.
Yeah, this is really interesting. Based on Chris Roberts' description of it, it seems like it's essentially a flying garage. He listed it as a flying toolbox, but it seems more to me like a garage. You essentially have a cockpit, engines, and then a workshop that you basically can have open to vacuum and just go out and repair things. And you can attach like magnetically to the hull of a ship you're working on and just kind of go to town. Yeah,
and that's actually like it almost sounds like it might be a replacement for the repair drones that were going to be made available. Except, obviously we can have players who profit off of that, which is kind of another interesting addition to the universe is space mechanic.
Right. Another interesting aspect that was revealed in the description that Chris Robert gave about this is actually a part of a much larger system called the Miller ERS, which is basically if you're working on something really big like a cap ship or something like that, you can actually have parts of this Miller ERS essentially be scaffolding and link multiple Anvil crucibles together to work on something like giant, like a Bengal carrier or something like that. So,
like, in that respect, it would actually almost make sense to have a fleet of these. You know what I mean? Like, the same way, obviously it wouldn't be implemented in the same way, but in the same vein that plumbers have a ton of plumbers that cover a city, if you have a lot of these, you can actually contract yourself out to work on large ships, whereas alone that might not be possible.
Right, and, setups like these might be especially valuable to very large organizations. They'd mentioned very early on in development that there'll be a couple Bengal carriers that are going to be up for grabs. You're probably going to have to restore them first, but also these are going to be persistent, and I imagine you're not just going to be able to roll up to like your local, shipyard on Stanton and be like, hey, I need repairs for my Bengal carrier. You're probably going to have to do a lot of that, on site yourself.
And probably secretly. So if you can operate with discretion, you're willing to make a lot of money.
Yeah, you might not want to broadcast the fact, like, hey, one of the 2-player, achievable Bengal carriers is parked right here. That might be bad. So,
so those are the 2 ships that have already been admitted into Wave 4 through the voting. The next winner is probably my favorite of the bunch, which is the Deep Space Fighter.
Yeah, as of the time of us recording this, the newest letter from the chairman has not been released yet, so we don't have a description for it yet, but we do know that we have passed the next milestone and that this was the highest voted option. I am super excited about this. For months, I've been telling Atlas that one of my dream ships in universe would essentially be an F-14, like an F-14 Space Tomcat. That would just be incredible. And then I saw that the twin-engine Deep Space Fighter was listed as an option in the voting scheme, and I was ecstatic.
Yeah, I was right there with Ben Richards. I've always had a fascination with the plane, and as soon as I saw Deep Space Fighter with twin engines, I thought, space F-14, done. I mean, we don't know that's necessarily how the design is going to come out, but it was enough of a romantic idea in my head to convince me to vote for it at every iteration of the vote.
Right, and I mean, I know, I'm pretty sure I heard somewhere that the developers were looking at like World War II options for heavy fighters using twin engines, but the threads that have been talking about it on the forums, pretty much everyone seems to be thinking about a Space Tomcat, or at the very least, something similar. A lot of people are posting pictures of the Soviet Cold War era kind of equivalent to the F-14. So I'm hoping the developers kind of keep that in mind when they're developing this spacecraft.
Yeah, definitely. And we're not exactly what constitutes deep space yet. At this point, if you've ever been on the forums, it's just been a lot of theory crafting, a lot of, well, this is what I think it is, this is what historically it would have been, here's the equivalents I can think of from World War II, and I'm not sure if it's really worth us, going into at length at this point. But the theory of the craft existing alone and the fact that it's supposed to set itself apart from the Hornet makes me interested.
Yeah, I think at the very least, if you have something that can travel long distances, like maybe the Hornet would have to refuel every jump it makes, whereas this thing might be able to just keep on going for multiple systems. I think it would be an excellent partner craft for security for something like a Retaliator, or even say like a Constellation Aquila that's doing some deep space exploration. Like a Hornet's not going to be able to keep up with it way out in the fringes to provide security for it, whereas something like this that's designed to just keep going could stick with it and provide security while they, research or whatever.
Right, exactly. And that's kind of what I was hoping it would be in the end. So congratulations to the Deep Space Fighter and anyone who voted for it. I'm sure you're all exactly as excited as Ben Richards and I are. So that being said, let's move on to what we expect out of PAX Australia.
All right, so first things first, they've announced that the Herald will be up for sale then. And it's actually really interesting because I always thought the Herald was kind of an interesting sounding craft, but it was never something, it didn't fit necessarily with what I was planning to do. But what we do know about it is that it's going to be an info running ship. It's going to have a special computer core that is shielded against things like EMP. It's going to be encrypted, and it should be easy to wipe. I was checking out the ever-changing ship stats page, and I think there's a pretty high chance that its stats are going to need to get rebalanced, because when I checked, it was half the weight of the M50 and had a TR4 engine. So
yeah, and there was concerns actually with the M50 because it was originally slated to have two TR3s upgradable to TR4, I think.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And people were essentially being liquefied in the pilot seat just by accelerating. So there's a high probability that the TR4 is probably going to make you black out just from hitting half throttle.
Considering, I believe when I checked it, it only weighs like 6,000. Yeah, so that's like nothing. I believe that's about half the weight of an M50, and yeah, the primary engine is listed as a TR4, which I think is just going to make you black out if you maneuver at all. So we'll have to see how they treat that.
Yeah, hopefully when they release the brochure, we'll
right.
get a better idea of what's happening there. But I like a lot of Drake ships. I usually like the way they look. Considering the price point of $85, if it's a solid-looking ship, I may just pick one up because $85 in this large scheme of Star Citizen ships at this point is actually on the more affordable side.
Right. I'm really curious to see how they go about designing the ship, because I've always really liked the utilitarianness that Drake ships offer, but this is a ship based entirely around technology, and so I'm really curious to see how they kind of blend those two things together.
Yeah, because they haven't even described how electronic warfare is going to work yet.
No, we know it's going to be a thing, but we don't know a lot about how it's going to work. So
I mean, aside from that, the armament's nothing impressive.
I mean, enough to defend itself, but yeah, certainly nothing impressive. It has 2 size 2 fixed class 1 weapons, and then it has 1 class 2 gimbaled mount.
Yeah,
of an undetermined nature.
No missiles.
No.
So don't get caught by a Hornet. Bro tip.
Yeah.
Although if you have a TR4, the odds of getting caught are small.
Right.
But the odds of living again are not that great because you're just gonna kill yourself by accelerating. So.
I mean, also given the weight, I gotta imagine it can't be very armored. So.
Right. Yeah, we've seen what happens when an M50 gets caught in the open by a Hornet.
Yeah, it gets shredded in about 2 seconds. So I think your best strategy in the Herald is going to use your speed to your advantage. I imagine they're probably going to make it a little heavier, and they're probably going to nerf the engines down a little bit, but it still should be a very fast and maneuverable craft.
Yeah. So for sure, Drake Herald going on sale for PAX Australia. There's also 2 additional ships that are going to have hangar sales.
Right. So we don't know what these are yet, but there's a lot of guesses floating around on the forums, and actually the guesses they have are enough to make my wallet very nervous. The first ship that is up for sale is potentially up for sale is the Retaliator. From what we've seen recently, it looked like it was very close to being hangar ready, and so that would kind of fit with it possibly going on sale. It hasn't been on sale since last year, I believe, and it has also been pretty much my dream ship since I first set eyes on Star Citizen. The reason it might make me sad if it goes on sale is it's also very expensive, at least for my budget. I think I heard last time it went on sale it was $250, and so I'm guessing if it goes on sale again, it's probably going to be closer to $300.
Yeah, ballpark around $300.
Which is a lot of money for me to drop on a game.
Not including variations, by the way.
Right. So as of right now, as far as I know, there are no variants currently planned for the Retaliator. That doesn't mean they're not going to do them. It's just they're not in the pipeline at the moment. So it will be, but yeah, so I'm particularly excited about that. I may break down and pick one up. I had a particularly busy week at work this week, so I have a bit more spending cash than usual. So we'll have to wait and see. Alice, did you want to go into detail on each of these ships as to like what they do, or did you kind of just want to move on?
We could ballpark them.
Yeah.
We don't have to go over the stats per se, but yeah. So we have the Retaliator, which is essentially a torpedo ship, a large torpedo ship. It's really meant more for hitting larger ships in itself, particularly capital ships, if you can find the original equipment. But essentially, it is a little bit larger than a Constellation. You can arm it a little bit heavier than a Constellation, but it's also heavily moddable.
Right, and that's one of the things I also thought was really interesting, is according to the lore they've established, this is a design that has been around for, at least 100 years. It was kind of the pinnacle bomber of the kind of, despotic dictatorship earlier in the history of the UEE, and then it's aging. And while it is still around, variants, as I said, have been around for like 100 years. So you have, desert planet-based shipyards that are just full of these things, and the culture has developed around basically restoring them, hot riding them out, customizing them to what they want. And I just found that to be really, really interesting. And so it's pretty much been my dream ship since I laid eyes on Star Citizen.
Right. And it is a really pretty ship, too. Aegis tends to have really organically flowing lines, and that really isn't any different with the Retaliator. I think the design is very pretty, just aesthetically pleasing. So that said, you do need a crew for it. It is, a 6-person crew for the ship?
Yeah, and that's the unfortunate thing. Me and Atlas are from like a relatively small organization, and most of the other people, our friends who are in it, are not nearly as interested in Star Citizen as we are. They're interested, but they're not quite as dedicated, and so crewing a Retaliator might be troublesome. You can crew it with AI, which is probably what I would do if I got one, but it is something to consider.
Yeah. So next step down, also, isn't this also from Aegis, the Gladius?
It is actually, yeah. Do you want to introduce this one since I took up most of the time on the Retaliator?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just go over it basically. The Gladius is essentially an escort fighter. It's a small, fast, maneuverable ship. The armaments aren't quite what you'd expect out of a Hornet or something akin to it, but it was basically designed to, if not annoy, then seriously distract fighters while bombers are trying to attempt to get their job done. It's a short range fighter. I think they were primarily designed to come out of carriers like escort carriers or Bengal carriers, and typically, or not typically, but theoretically, they were designed to be replaceable, cheap to produce, and cheap to fix.
Right. I mean, I remember when these things first came out, everyone wasn't really impressed by the stats because it was basically about the same size and weight as an M50, but it had TR2 engines. It had two TR2 engines, and everyone was like, well, the M50 is just going to blow that away. It didn't have anything impressive in terms of the weapons loadout. The power plant was decent, but other than that, there wasn't anything super special about it. But now that the M50 also has TR2 engines, it's a much more compelling option. I believe when it originally went on sale, it was somewhere around the $80 to $90 range. I don't really remember. And I think if it comes back this time, it'll probably be a very popular ship.
Yeah, especially for the price point. It's giving you a decent fighter option for what we expect to be around $100. And it's approaching dogfighting from a completely different angle from the Hornet. Because the Hornet is essentially a tank in space.
Right.
And the Gladius is approaching it more from a nimble fighter. It's using agility and maneuvering to its advantage. So I think the Gladius is actually a really good looking ship.
I do as well.
And I might be tempted to pick one up.
Same.
But the fact that it's short range, I think you're going to have to purchase a jump drive to upgrade it.
Yeah, I believe so.
I don't think it's going to come with it stock.
No. As far as I know, the only fighter that comes with a jump drive stock is the F7CM, which is the Super Hornet.
Does the 300 come with a jump drive?
I don't believe so, unless you're talking about the 315P. I believe that one does.
Okay. So yeah, that kind of hurts a little bit, especially considering I already have, other ships that can hold their own without the need of a Gladius. The one thing that I think is really interesting, like the Retaliator, is the Gladiator, which is a small... Isn't that a one-person crew?
I believe the Gladiator actually might have a two-person crew,
Okay.
A pilot and then like a rear gunner, basically, because I believe it has a small defensive turret.
Gotcha. So that's kind of what we don't have yet, I think, is a bomber at this point.
Well, yeah, at least a single-person bomber. It'll be really interesting to see how these are employed in the persistent universe. I mean, in World War II, you had, small torpedo bombers like this dealing massive damage to big, giant battleships. So,
it seems like that's going to be the replacement, basically.
Right.
From what I've seen of the Gladiator, it's actually a really pretty plane, but they've been avoiding giving us like a full glimpse of the ship.
Yeah, they've been really coy about it. The video where they showed off the Retaliator and the Gladius, they showed little tiny bits of the Gladiator, but not much.
Yeah, which is kind of a bummer. I'd like to get a better peek at it, but that being said, we don't. I personally don't know too many details about the ship besides that. In terms of speed or range or things like that.
Right, I'm looking at it right now. It has a two-person crew, max power plant size of 4, comes with a 3 stock. Oh, that's interesting.
That's actually a pretty sizable power plant.
It has 2 TR4 main thrusters, at least according to the stats page. It actually looks like it should move pretty good. And then it does not list the weapons loadout. According to this, it has one class 1, 1 class 3, and 1 class 4. So it looks like it's going to have some kind of turret in the rear for defense and a class 1, gun up front probably, and then some kind of large class 3 mount so it can carry torpedoes. Maybe not as big as the Retaliator, but sizable at the very least.
Yeah, well, torpedoes themselves set themselves apart from missiles, so it's meant to do some damage.
Right. It's really interesting, I think, how they have a rock, paper, scissors approach where you have basically fighters, big ships, and bombers.
Yeah. You basically have the interceptors, the bombers, and then the capitals. And there's degrees of that in between.
Right.
But that is the basic triangle of, ship creation.
So it will be good to see how people, build their fleets up to defend against various threats.
Yeah. And I definitely feel like the next one we're going to talk about kind of breaks from that, which is the Redeemer.
Right.
Because it is specifically a troop gunship.
Right. It is meant to carry a squad of, Marines into battle, possibly for boarding or planet-side operations, although I don't know how much they've talked about planet-side operations yet. That seems to be something they're kind of playing down at the moment.
Especially shipborne.
Right. Shipbornes is where it's going to get really interesting, having people, breach an airlock and board a ship, like in Idris, for example.
Yeah. Speaking of planet side, I forgot to mention this earlier. The FPS team did mention that there will be FPS encounters either within cities or planet side. Specifically, when it comes to cities, they did mention that obviously lawless places, they will not be checking for weapons.
Right.
So you can expect, rowdy encounters out in the frontier.
Also, it sounded like technicals might be a thing as well.
Yeah, they will be implementing vehicles. I almost wonder if that's not more in line with like an open battlefield versus within the city, but I'm not sure.
Right.
Just wanted to take that sidestep real quick and then get back to the Redeemer. I actually really like the way the Redeemer looks.
So do I.
I'm really curious to find out about the armament in more detail.
It kind of reminds me in principle of the Soviet Hind attack helicopter. Like it has an offensive armament, but it's also meant to carry troops in the back.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it feels to me like a landing ship.
Yeah.
But it's the way, if I recall, was designed was to drop troops. Like actually drop troops, not like have an entry point like the Cutlass. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if it's going to be possible for them to drop troops into EVA and then have them enter ships on their own.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see if they give it like a docking collar like the Cutlass has, or if they're going to have people basically, depressurize the crew, like the hold where they keep all the Marines, and then just have them basically exit into EVA and then breach from the outside and enter that way.
Yeah. There's a lot of. I think the Redeemer excites me in that it's one of the few ways that's been talked about so far to actually breach a ship outside of the docking collar.
Right.
So aside from the Redeemer, we have the Mustang.
Right, and the Mustang to me is a little less exciting, but I think it is good that we're adding another entry-level option. Yeah. The one thing I'm kind of curious about is if this is the option, Sandy Gardner's posted 2 pictures that look like they're out of a Mustang commercial, and a while ago the community voted on like what would the next commercial be, and I believe the Mustang was a part of that poll, and the Retaliator was actually what ended up winning that. So I'm not sure if they might have bumped the Mustang to the head of the line, or what would be really cool is if they did the Retaliator and the Mustang, and we had 2 trailers in one event, but I don't know how likely that is.
Has there been any mention of commercials being displayed at PAX Australia, or is that something we're going to have to wait for the next convention to see?
I have not heard anything one way or another. I think if they did bring back the Retaliator, though, and they were doing a sale, they would probably, show that, and I feel like if they put the Mustang up for sale, it is likely that they would do a commercial for that. I think if it's the Redeemer, I think if it's the Gladius or the Gladiator, probably not. If it's the Redeemer, maybe. I only say that because when they were in the Next Great Starship competition, they kind of already made like a little commercial for it.
Yeah.
For the final stages, so it wouldn't be a huge stretch that they might make one for that, but yeah.
Okay, so that's basically the whole list of hangar ships that might come up for sale at PAX. That's really the last topic we have to talk about, so I just want to conclude things by saying thanks for listening. This is kind of a lengthy podcast, I know, But this is Atlas saying thanks. I appreciate it.
And Ben Richards saying thank you as well. And also, always remember to check your audio levels before you record for an hour and a half.
Yes, mistakes
Have a
were
good
made.
evening, everybody.